Welcome back to Yang Daily. I'll be your host, Alex Cheney, bringing you all the Yang news you need to live your life right. Sorry for the super late release. Looks like I don't get Saturday off after all, though you are still on your own for Saturday news. We have a lot to get through today, thanks to Trump. It's going to be unpleasant, but it's important to know nonetheless. I also got delayed a bit by an exciting new development, but it's not time to reveal that. That's right, it's a secret. Anyway, shout out to our Tier 3 patrons, Peter Park and Shay Meehan, and all of our other patrons. This news is dedicated to you. In fact, maybe I will let our patrons in on the secret in advance. That's right, patron perks, baby. Gotta share the love. Check the Patreon website to be the first to know. Now let's get to the news so I can get it out before midnight. I did promise. So remember how I was concerned that Trump was trying to sabotage the election by ensuring the results would be invalid, and how he refused to abide by the results, and how he's undermining trust in mail-in voting, and saying the Dems will rig the election, and potentially sabotaging the Postal Service, and suggested delaying the election? Well, now he's told people straight up to commit election fraud by voting twice. He tweeted, quote, "On election day or early voting, go to your polling place to see whether or not your mail-in vote has been counted. If it has, you will not be able to vote and the mail-in system worked properly. If it has not been counted, vote, which is a citizen's right to do." End quote. Let me be clear, voting twice is a felony and polling stations will not know if you just sent in a mail ballot that has not yet been counted. People following Trump's advice will cause chaos at polling stations, delay voting for everyone else who have not already voted by mail. They will attempt to cast a second vote. They will be caught when the second vote is registered, and they will have committed a felony. From Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, quote, "The president's idea is a great one for people looking to go to jail," end quote. I would just like to let it sink in that our president has now floated the idea of violating the Constitution by delaying the election, has refused to abide by the results of the election, and has now blatantly told voters to commit voter fraud. Let that simmer. To make it worse, Facebook, which just passed a set of new, supposedly more stringent rules to protect against voter fraud, decided not to take down Trump's post. Instead, they decided to add a generic label with information about voting. That later changed to a vague label emphasizing the security of mail-in voting. Quote, "Voting by mail has a long history of trustworthiness in the U.S., and the same is predicted this year," end quote. Not exactly the response you'd expect of a president advising people to commit felony voter fraud. Separately, Facebook said it had removed posts containing video footage of a Trump speech on Wednesday where he has also suggested that people vote twice. A Facebook policy employee posted a more detailed explanation for the decision in the workplace thread. Quote, "While all states prohibit attempts to vote more than once, the post does not explicitly call for people to vote twice, except that circumstantially it does. Rather, it encourages individuals to check the status of the mail-in ballot and, if necessary, to cast a ballot in person. This may be permitted in some jurisdictions under provisional ballot rules. As such, this post does not meet the criteria of our voting inference policies," end quote. That decision and the fact that it took hours to make inspired anger and disbelief among Facebook employees. Many pointed out that the policy team's reasoning cited the lack of an explicit call to vote twice from Trump, even though the newly announced policy specifically said Facebook will remove implicit misrepresentations as well. And again, he absolutely advised people to do something that will lead some, those whose mail-in ballots have not been counted when they reach the polling station, to attempt to vote twice. But it's not just the election that we have for dictator red flags today. We also have his ongoing attacks against the freed press. In a recent memo, the Pentagon delivered an order to shutter Stars and Stripes, an independent, tax-funded military newspaper that has been a lifeline and a voice for American troops since the Civil War. Stars and Stripes is printed at sites around the world and delivered daily to troops, even those on the front lines, where the internet is spotty or inaccessible. As the local paper for the military, it provides intensive and critical coverage of issues that are important to members of the nation's armed services and cuts through the political and military brass BS. The memo orders the publisher to present a plan that dissolves the Stars and Stripes by September 15th, including specific timeline for vacating government-owned or leased space worldwide. In response, Trump heroically jumped in to protect the paper, tweeting, quote, "The United States of America will not be cutting funding to Stars and Stripes magazine under my watch," end quote. The only problem is the Pentagon informed reporters in February it was planning to reduce funding for the newspaper, and the Trump White House didn't speak out against the Pentagon's plan to close the paper before Friday, even though it's been in the works and publicly written about for months, and was in the president's own budget request. The memo ordering the publication's dissolution claims the administration has the authority to make this move under the president's fiscal year 2021 Defense Department budget request, which zeroed out the $15.5 million annual subsidy for Stars and Stripes. In other words, Trump knew about this, Trump approved of this, and only now, when Trump is under fire for disparaging remarks about our service members, is Trump speaking out against it. Meanwhile, Congress, which under the Constitution has the power to make decisions about how the public's money is spent, has not yet approved the president's earlier request to cut funding to Stars and Stripes. In fact, the defense budget that the democratically controlled House approved earlier this summer explicitly overruled the decision to cut funding for Stars and Stripes. The Senate has not yet finalized a defense spending budget. Many distinguished military members have come out saying that the loss of Stars and Stripes would have an enormously negative impact on the paper's more than 1.3 million readers. It would eliminate a symbol of the U.S. commitment to freedom of the press, flout the judgment of generations of military leaders, and usurp the authority that the Constitution gives Congress to make decisions about how the government spends money. Just one more case of Trump attempting to shut down an independent press that speaks any criticism against him, i.e., any actually free press, while simultaneously pretending to be the good guy. Did someone say Trump assaulting free press? Because Trump also appointed a new head to USAGM, the parent organization of Voice of America, a while back. VOA is another taxpayer-funded independent news organization whose mission is a form of soft diplomacy to embody democratic principles through fair reporting and to replace a free press in countries where there is none. Trump nominated PAC, a Republican filmmaker who has previously collaborated with former Trump strategist Steve Bannon. According to NPR, journalists at Voice of America and some of PAC's colleagues at the agency headquarters say he started with a desire to root out what he sees as anti-Trump bias. The nomination languished in the Senate until this year, but found new life after Trump and the White House attacked VOA in the spring for failing to sufficiently blame the Chinese for the pandemic's spread and for reporting that China's lockdown response had been effective, which it was, claiming that the VOA had fallen for Chinese propaganda, i.e., Trump was angry that a government-funded news agency wasn't parroting his own propaganda to offload all blame onto China. PAC took office in June and quickly upended the federal broadcasters. PAC has fired every head of the 4 news outlets under his agency, as well as the members of the bipartisan boards that governed them. PAC replaced the boards mostly with political appointees of the Trump administration, shocking, and named himself as chairman. He sacked the executive editor of Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe. The senior news editor who oversaw VOA's standards and practices was reassigned to a corporate position earlier this summer and has since played no role in guiding coverage or scrutinizing stories flagged as problematic. Many of the people who were leading the agency when PAC arrived already held sterling conservative credentials in Washington. He has withheld approval of visa extensions that foreign employees need to continue working for the networks. A return home without U.S. protection could leave these employees and their families vulnerable to retaliation from regimes hostile to the U.S. government or to VOA's reporting of their crimes. A group of journalists at Voice of America signed a letter of protest saying PAC was harming U.S. strategic interests and imperiling the lives of their colleagues who are foreign citizens by refusing to extend their work visas. The reports also cited Pac's remarks on a recent podcast posted to the conservative website The Federalist, in which he joked about shutting off air conditioning and prohibiting masks in VOA's building in Washington amid a global pandemic. In the letter, dismissed senior executives said, quote, "We have watched in dismay as USAGM executives have been dismissed for, in their words, attempting to educate the new CEO on avoiding legal violations as well as guiding him on the firewall that protects VOA's legally mandated editorial independence." End quote. USAGM, under its new leadership, tweeted out a thread saying that the letter of protest was inappropriate and it would not therefore respond. Instead, it suggested that those who signed could be subject to disciplinary response, calling it an administrative issue. Apparently, the free press is not even free to speak amongst themselves now. Several executives who left or were suspended by PAC told NPR that the CEO openly broods over questions of loyalty and sidelined them because they were willing to push back against his instincts. Turner described PAC's outlook as paranoid. By sweeping knowledgeable staffers away and even refusing to approve standard budgets, 8 current or former staffers for USAGM and Voice of America said the agency under PAC had in many ways broken down. Officials say they were unable to fulfill orders for toilet paper for a transmitting facility or a cleaning contract for a shortwave broadcasting center in Kuwait. Staffers say Trump's appointee is threatening to wash away legal protections intended to insulate their news reports from political meddling. What we're seeing now is a step-by-step and wholesale dismantling of the institutions that protect the independence and the integrity of our journalism, says Sean Powers, until recently the chief strategist officer for USAGM. So, I don't know. Seems like a concerning development for anyone who doesn't want to live in a dictatorship. Moving on, wage theft, or the failure of employers to pay employees what they are owed, is on the rise during the pandemic, as it has risen during every recession. Not only are employers falling on tough times, but also states are cutting budgets, leaving fewer resources to investigate claims. As we discussed before, Trump's administration removed the chief legal punishment for wage theft from the law. Employees are more afraid of losing their jobs by speaking up for their rights due to the increased difficulty in finding another job, and wage theft can put artificial pressure on competitors to do the same in instances where the wage theft is malicious and the reduced cost is used to undercut on prices. The paper's numbers show that more than 20% of low-wage workers were probably paid less than what the law requires in April, when the unemployment rate peaked, up from just over 10% before the pandemic. Economist Abigail Wozniak points out that the number of people able to afford food has been dropping fairly steadily for weeks now, showing in the clearest possible way that further economic relief is required. Our people are literally starving while the Republican Senate refuses to offer more than crumbs. She also notes that in addition to African Americans being laid off at higher rates, they are now being rehired at lower rates, further exacerbating the inequalities of systemic racism. Speaking of which, John Oliver just did a great episode on racism in jury selection, which disenfranchises people of color from a fair trial by their peers, likely contributing greatly to the observed disparity of incarceration and sentencing of minors, especially African Americans. John has a whole mini-series of episodes covering racism in pretty much all aspects of the justice system, which is well worth watching. Again, it is these indirect forms of racism that make systemic racism so easy to ignore, yet so debilitating to people of color in America. Then, of course, there are the more blatant incidents, such as a case yesterday where a black man was having his car towed following an accident. Police refused to let the man get his legal documents out of his car before it was towed, despite that these documents may have been needed to retrieve the car from impound. Arguing ensued, and minutes later, police ran him over as he crossed the street in a crosswalk on his way home. Racist? Probably. Police brutality? Almost certainly. I should note that I'm not nearly reporting every incident like this that happens, because sadly there are too many. Just know that for every one of these you hear about, there are dozens or hundreds more. On a somewhat lighter note, Yang gave a full-on smackdown to Vince McMahon on Twitter yesterday, blasting him for exploitation of his wrestlers. Quote, If I'm not the Secretary of Labor, I'm pretty confident I'll have his or her number to talk about the ridiculous classification of WWE wrestlers as independent contractors while controlling their name and likeness for years. Come on, Vince, you've already deprived the folks breaking their backs for you of health care, security, recovery time, retirement payments, and fair treatment regarding licenses and royalties. At least let them make a living off their own names. Vince, you'd better hope your old friend Donald wins, because change is in the air, and changes are long overdue where your corrupt labor practices are concerned. It would give me great pleasure. The people know. End quote. Whew. I'm not a wrestling fan, but this kind of drama I can appreciate. Get 'em, Yang. Judging by the comments, Yang earned himself a lot of new supporters every time he calls out this issue. It's still little known that he has a policy on martial arts worker rights. Zach Grauman hopped on Nerds for Humanity's podcast for an episode discussing the campaign yesterday. You can catch that in the links below. And finally, Yang Gang and Burners are uniting to push the hashtag #WinWithDavid to promote David Kim for Congress in California. It's rare to see these two camps openly allied, and it's something that we need much more of. I know there's a lot of disagreement between Bernie and Yang and their respective followers. I've certainly expressed my own concerns of Bernie on this podcast before. But I don't agree with Yang on everything either. I still work with him on what we do agree on, because that's how progress is made. Not only will working together on this help David, it will build inroads for working together on UBI, universal health care, democracy reform, and so many other issues that we have in common. Pushing alone won't get us anywhere. Finding common goals and pushing together is how humanity got where we are today, and it's how we'll get where we need to go. As Matt said so powerfully, quote, Burners took on the healthcare industry and brought Medicare for All to the national spotlight in just a few years. Yang Gang brought UBI from 22% support to majority support in 2 years. Imagine what Burners and Yang Gang could do if they worked together. End quote. And that'll do it for today's Yang Daily. Share and bookmark Trump's attacks on democracy and the free press, and the racial bias in juries episode. Help trend Win with David. Help recruit other organizations to the cause and get everyone to sign the UBI petition. Flood Congress and Trump with calls, tweets, and letters using the Resist bot or Income Movement easy contacts below. If you need help, consult Humanity Forward, the Income Movement Aid Database, the Mission Asset Fund, United Way, or the H3 podcast thread. And don't forget to Yang Daily.